Yeah, you're Jake.
All right, I'm Nick Harris.
I'm Annie Gentry. Taylor Owen. Taylor Bungie.
All right, and we're going to show to you tetrapods, the turtles. So turtles are one of the more unique reptiles, like how they evolved is a lot different looking than, the other ones they think they were related to. So here is the turtle. This is the carapace, the back, and then the plastron, which is the stomach. How these fuse, its ribs span out, and its shoulder blades are actually inside of its ribs. So you can imagine your own shoulder blades being inside your own ribs. And because of this, they can't expand and contract, so they actually breathe in a different method, which we'll talk about later. And this is made up of about 50 bones, so that's a lot. It's obviously its biggest use is protection, but it also can store fat and water, so it's more than just one use. And just a little fun facts, I guess turtles have excellent eyesight and smell, and they live in every continent but Antarctica. So really, turtles are like an evolution masterpiece. Like they're winning really well. And now we're going to talk about how the embryonic development.
All right, so I'm going to show you a graphic that kind of illustrates what I'm going to be talking about. So turtles, don't do that. So when turtles develop, their ribs are naturally a little bit shorter, but these are their scapula here. And you can see like they start out on the outside of their body, and then those are the pelvic bone, or those are the pelvic bones, those are the scapula, and they actually form in while the ribs go out. So turtles have dorsal ribs. So if you think of our ribs, we have lateral ribs, so they wrap all the way around. So we have them on our back, but they also come around and protect our organs. Whereas turtles just have them on the back, and so all of this develops on the inside of that, which is because of their shell. So over time, their ribs have fused together on the inside, which provides structure and support for the shell. And then you can compare that to how a chicken develops. Which is more like how we develop. So they have the ribs that wrap all the way around, and then the pelvic bones and the scapula form on the outside, as you can see here. And they do that number instead of being on the inside. And so to compensate for the fact that the ribs are only on the dorsal side, they have the plastron, which is the stomach, protects their stomach and internal organs, much like the shell does. And then, so there are a couple other interesting things about the way that turtles develop. The temperature can actually determine the sexes of some turtles. So in some turtles, the lower temperatures, around 28 Celsius, hatch males, and then around 31 Celsius will hatch a female turtle, and then anything in between that will get about a 50-50 ratio. And then in other turtles, the extreme lows and extreme highs will hatch females, and then the moderate temperatures will hatch males. And also turtles, so if you think of like a sea turtle laying its eggs, they dig a hole and they lay layers of eggs and they cover it back up. So the bottom is always going to be colder than on top, and so the colder eggs are going to develop more slowly and the warmer eggs are going to develop more quickly. But turtles actually all hatch at the same time, and this is because developing eggs produce CO2. So they all they communicate with each other in a way and regulate the amount of CO2 that's being produced so that all of them actually end up hatching at the same time, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah, so that's how a turtle is developed.
Okay, I'm going to touch on some of the key characteristics and similarities and differences between the ancestors of the turtles and then the turtles that are actually living today. So as far as the ancestral species goes, they had a vertebrae, a shoulder girdle, and a pelvic bone that's actually outside of the ribs. Their body shape was a lot more elongated, and most of them actually had teeth. They had a carapace, except for it wasn't hard, it was softer. And also they had traces of a forming pastron, and one of the biggest differences was the fact that they had diapsid as well as anapsid figures, not with just anapsid like today. And then today's turtles, oh, I was gonna say this turtle.
Sure.
You can see that the outside is actually really hard. They formed it as like a defensive mechanism against their predators and stuff. Their ribs have actually elongated and flattened to become a part of that carapace. They actually in here have something called an abdominal muscle sling, and that helps them breathe because their ribs are so stretched out now. There's nothing to like hold them back. Their pelvic bone has grown underneath it as opposed to outside of it, and they actually have a beak instead of teeth, which was interesting. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different transitional species that scientists have discovered over the past couple of years. We're going to start off with this one, the Euoptosaurus. It's the oldest that they've found to date. It's 260 million years old. They found that it was from the Permian period in South Africa. It had teeth, no shell. It was most certainly diapsid with the holes behind the eyes to help with their jaw movement. And their pelvis is right behind their ribs. Most of the similarities include the fact that their ribs were more enlarged than other species during their time period, and they're also a vertebrae, which is pretty general for most of the species at that time. Next is the Papochellus, which is arguably the key missing transitional form. It's 240 million years old. It was found in Germany. It also had teeth, and its tail was long. And the similarities were that the plastron had just begun to form on the stomach, and it was the key transitional figure because that was the first time we saw a plastron in any kind of animal up until then. So it shows that the fusion of ribs and the shoulder girdle had transformed into the shell eventually. Next we have Odontochellus, which is 220 million years old, and you can see where its back starts to become a little bit more dome-shaped. It still had like longer legs, but the flippers had started to form. Its plastron had fully developed by then, and also the embryology was found to be similar. Last, we have the most recent find, which is 210 million years old. It's the Proganochellus. The biggest similarity, key characteristic, is the hard carapace, the outer shell. That's kind of like the notable characteristic of today's turtles. Fossil evidence suggests that most of these turtles had shorter legs, like the turtles today, and that the ancestors were actually terrestrial instead of aquatic, which was one of the big controversies that scientists have faced up until now. And now I'm going to discuss the phylogenetic tree. First, we're going to start broad with Sauropsida, and that just means that it has a lizard face in Latin, and that the fertilized egg remains within the mom, and that they're amniotes. Next, we go down to Euroreptilia, which just means that they're mostly diapsid, and then there's a few anapsid exceptions, which is how we eventually get to the only anapsid turtles today. Next, we have Bromurida and Diapsida. They're very similar, just the fact that the separations in their jaws and the holes start to spread out farther in their head. Next, we get to Neodiapsida, which it takes out some of the more primitive diapsids. Then this actually branches off into these two, Lepidosauromorpha and Archosauromorpha. Lepidosauromorpha is basically has to do with their gait, the way they walk. They walk in more of like a roundabout lizard, like sprawling gait. And the Archosauromorphas have a parasitical gait, which is like humans walk. It's more bilateral and like symmetrical on both sides. And also the Archosauromorphas lose their sternum, or at least it reduces in size. And then last we come to the most comparable ancestor, which is Pantostudines, and they have the dome-shaped back, and the Testudinata come from the Pantostudines. That's just a fancy word for today's turtles, and they have the hard outer shell carapace in the back. And so now Taylor is going to talk about some of the problems that they face in like the more skeletal structures.
So shit scientists face. One of the big controversies in the scientific community is really this placement on the phylogenetic tree. Turtles are one of the last reptiles to really be solidified into place. So the big discrepancy is like the scientific communities that look at the phenotype, the morphology, the fossils, a lot of the fossil records, paleontologists,
And then the more recent technological advances that have to do with like DNA and genetic analysis of turtles and other reptiles, and developmental biology as well. So all these different scientific communities are like currently gathering and disputing, like they disagree how and really from what these turtles are developing. And a lot of this is due to their derived morphology and how the characteristics of the ancestors are very different from the modern. Because even if you look at what Annie was talking about, like there's a huge difference between just how those look. You can tell by the picture. So there's still a lot of gaps that scientists are having to fill. So one of the big contributors to this controversy is really looking at the skulls. So here we have two reptilian skulls. We have the anapsid skull, which has no openings near the temple. And this is what all ancient reptiles had. And then most of them developed into the diapsid skull, which has openings near the temple. The fossil record and the morphology, these scientists are suggesting that turtles descended from these ancient anapsids, which is kind of what those pictures are showing. But then the more recent DNA analysis are suggesting that turtles are related to like the archosauroclades and like birds and crocodiles, which leads to questions of how they have their anapsid skull, since they're the only living reptiles with this type of skull. So there's questions like, was the temporal lobe just lost over time if they started diapsid? But basically it just raises a lot of scientific questions. And fossils are helping to bridge the gap so far, but scientists are continuing to gather evidence to discover the origin, classification, and evolution of these beautiful, complex creatures. There you go. So any questions?
Okay, so did they transition from the land to the water too?
They actually did the water to the land. It's that they were trying to figure out if it was aquatic or terrestrial, so they're starting to do research, or they did research, and they're still continuing to research whether or not they're more closely related to their aquatic ancestors or terrestrial ancestors. 'Cause
Okay,
they
but
actually
they do
came
have
from
both.
both.
Okay.
I have two questions. So, what came first, the sea turtle or just the freshwater turtle?
It's three or land.
Where at?
The land,
Tortoise.
yeah. The tortoise.
I mean, most of the research I did would like lead up into like regular snapping turtles, or
Mhm.
I didn't think about sea turtles. That's a good question.
And then, or didn't really get sea turtles, I didn't want to fit in.
Wait, what was the second one?
I was like, is like the freshwater or land turtle, is that just like much of an in-depth, important process of how the hatching of the eggs are for sea turtles? See how sea turtles have to like get up, like it's a huge process when they make it to the ocean.
Mhm.
That's why they learn a lot of interesting things. I was wondering, like, this is intense for a freshwater turtle.
I think the biggest problem with sea turtles trying to get to the ocean is just how vulnerable they are from their
Yeah.
nest to the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So if I just had to make a guess, I'd say that it wouldn't have been as big a deal because they just have like a nest in the woods somewhere. But
The land turtles are more naturally on land and like they're more suited to that environment, so they don't have as many problems, or like it's not as dire for them, and also nobody poaches land turtle eggs. So more of them survive.
Another question? So where does a real first true shell appear?
the first shell isn't seen until the
So that's a
Proganoshell
problem,
is.
huh?
Mhm.
But was there fossil evidence of the group before that they had expanded ribs?
Which one?
I can't read it, Odontoceles?
Odontoceles.
Tooth turtle. Is that a tooth turtle? Do they have teeth?
They all have teeth. Even the Progogenitales had
Okay,
teeth.
so
They didn't
turtle
start to
tooth.
get like a beak. Like they had a beak as well.
Okay, but they still had
they
teeth.
still had teeth. Yeah.
So did they have expanded ribs, Odontoceles?
They actually saw larger ribs in comparison with other species,
Okay.
all the way back to the Unitosaurus. But they didn't start to develop until like a carapace until Odontochelys.
You said that was the first part where there was actual shell, but is there any evidence of shoulders like inside of the ribs on the earlier ones?
Yeah, that's when they started like what she was talking about with the embryonic development. As far as Odontochelys goes, inside the actual embryo, they would fold over, whereas we expand out, but they would actually fold over to where their pelvic girdle goes into them. So that's where it started with Odontochelys, and I think it's cool because like here's a little picture of it, and you can see the little turtle shell in the embryo starting, or the carapace starting to form, because this will start to come in.
Crazy. Well, others? I like turtles.
Just been waiting to say that the whole time.
I don't know, but I like turtles. All right, Colin.